The harder you try to fall asleep, the more awake you feel. We assume effort always brings results, but sometimes pushing just jams the door. This is the backwards law. It's as reliable as gravity and completely indifferent to your opinion. What follows won't ask you to try harder. Instead, it breaks down exactly how your own effort works against you. Once you spot a trap, you stop walking into it. You'll recognize yourself in these pages. Let the discomfort happen. Each chapter ends with a single question. Take your time with them. The silence after the question is where the real work happens. Let's begin. Introduction. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that has no good name in ordinary language. It's not the tiredness that sleep fixes. It's the tiredness that comes from sustained, disciplined, earnest effort towards something that never quite arrives. You felt it, the trying that somehow produces more distance. The reaching that leaves the thing further away than it was before you reached. This is not a personal failure, it's a structural one. And the structure, once you see it clearly, turns out to be one of the most consistent features of conscious human experience. The premise of this teaching is simple, and it will likely resist you at first, because the mind that's been working very hard for a very long time doesn't easily welcome a simple thing. The premise is this. There exists a category of states, experiences, and qualities of being that are constitutionally incapable of being achieved through direct pursuit. They belong to what we might call the surrendered register, and the harder you pursue them from the front, the more perfectly they retreat. Sleep is one, spontaneous confidence is one. The feeling of ease in a room full of strangers is one. The quiet certainty that you are enough, that what you have is sufficient, that the life you're living is the one you actually inhabit, rather than one you're merely waiting to deserve. These belong to that register too. You cannot force your way into them. Every attempt to do so activates a mechanism in the mind that this teaching will make visible to you. A warden that watches for the very thing you're trying not to feel, and in watching ensures you keep feeling it. The ancient teachers knew this. They encoded it differently depending on the tradition they were working inside, but the knowledge itself is consistent across centuries and cultures. The Taoists spoke of Wu Wei, the action that is not action, the power of the one who doesn't fight the river. The early phenomenologists of the European clinical tradition stumbled into it through observation of their patients. The contemplatives of every lineage left it in their writings as a kind of watermark, visible only when you hold the page at the right angle. What I've done in assembling this text is hold those pages at that angle. I've traced the common mechanism beneath the different vocabularies and found that it is not mystical at all. It's structural. It operates according to principles that are once named, entirely recognizable. You've seen this law at work in your own experience so many times that when I show it to you, you won't be surprised. You'll feel, instead, the particular relief of finally having a name for something you've lived. The journey this text takes you on moves through territories both intimate and philosophical. We'll begin with the small, undeniable, everyday proof, the moments from ordinary life where the backwards quality of certain pursuits is impossible to miss once it's pointed out. From there, we'll descend into the mechanism itself, the interior architecture of the ironic mind. And from there, we'll turn toward the older teachings and what they understood about how a person might, without force, without striving, enter the states that striving had always kept just out of reach. This is not a passive teaching. It will ask something of you, but what it asks is not effort in the direction you're used to applying it. And here is the question that opens the door, the one I ask you to carry with you before we begin the first chapter proper. Is it possible that the life you most want to be living isn't hidden behind some wall you haven't yet climbed, but is instead waiting just behind you, in the direction you stop looking when you're trying too hard to find it? Chapter 1. The door that opens when you stop pushing. There is a door. You've stood in front of it. You know the feeling, even if you've never named it this way before. It's the feeling of wanting something so completely, so precisely that the wanting itself becomes a kind of pressure, a leaning, a white-knuckled reaching forward into space that never closes the distance. You've felt it, and you've noticed, in your quieter moments, that the leaning never seems to work. Not really. Not the way it promises to. That's the door. And this is what I'll tell you about it. The thing the old teachers buried inside, metaphor and parable, the thing I want to say plainly here so it can settle into you without decoration. The door doesn't open by being pushed. It opens when you've turned away from it, not in defeat, not in despair, but in something rarer and stranger than either of those, a kind of relaxed interior turning, a releasing of the grip so complete that the door, finding nothing to resist against, swings open on its own. This isn't poetry, it's architecture. It's the actual structure of how arrival works, and once you see it, you'll see it everywhere, embedded in the grain of every experience you've ever had. Let's start somewhere ordinary. You're trying to remember a name, someone's name, right at the edge of your mind, and you can feel it there, hovering, almost touchable. And so you push, you concentrate, you reach for it harder, you go over the alphabet letter by letter, and the name recedes. It doesn't just stay out of reach, it actively withdraws, moving back with every step you take toward it. Then you give up. You think about something else entirely, something completely unrelated, and 30 seconds later the name surfaces clear as water without being called. It was never hiding, it was repelled by the reaching. You know this experience, you've had it dozens of times. Now notice what you just witnessed. The direct pursuit of the thing produced its opposite, its absence. The release of pursuit produced the arrival. This is not an accident. It's not a quirk of memory or a strange exception to the rule. It is the rule. It's the law that governs a wider territory than most people ever suspect, and every chapter of this teaching will show you more of that territory until you can recognize the shape of it in every corner of your life. There's another room you've been in. You've been in a conversation where you were trying very hard to be charming, to be interesting, to land well in someone's estimation. And it wasn't working. You could feel yourself laboring. The harder you worked, the more mechanical you became, the more the easy, natural version of yourself retreated somewhere behind the performance. And then there was some other moment, maybe later that same evening, when you forgot to try, when you got interested in something being said, or distracted by something across the room, and in that forgetting, you became, effortlessly, exactly the person you'd been straining to perform. The trying was the interference, not the obstacle outside you, the trying itself. This is what the ancient Taoist teachers were pointing at when they spoke of Wu Wei, a phrase that translates poorly into English because English wants action to mean effort. Wu Wei is usually rendered as effortless action or non-doing, but neither quite captures it. What they meant was action that doesn't strain against the nature of what's happening. Water doesn't try to flow downhill. A tree doesn't try to grow toward light. the softness overcomes the hardness, not by attacking it, but by finding the shape that stone creates, and moving around it, through it, beneath it, until what was once immovable is worn through. The backwards door is the doorway that only soft things can open, and softness here is a precise technical term, not a gentle suggestion. It means a quality of inner state, a released quality as distinct from the clenched quality of pursuit. It's the difference between a hand that's open and a hand that's gripping. The open hand can receive. The gripping hand repels by its own tension. I want you to feel this as more than metaphor. Think of what it is actually like to pursue something urgently. What happens in the body? There's a constriction, a narrowing. The attention sharpens to a point and becomes, paradoxically, less capable of registering the field around it. You felt this in a moment of frustration, looking for something you've misplaced. Eyes scanning over the object again and again without seeing it because the urgency has narrowed your actual perception. Then someone else walks into the room, unbothered, and spots it immediately. They weren't burdened by the needing to find it, so they could see. This is the mechanism, not a philosophy yet, a mechanism. The urgency of pursuit generates the inner conditions that make arrival impossible. The state of needing to find distorts the very faculties that finding requires. Now let this expand. Let it touch the larger territories of your life. Think of a state you've wanted, not a thing, a state. The state of feeling settled in yourself. The state of moving through the world with ease. The state of being in your right life, your right expression, your right skin. And notice whether you've been pursuing those states the way you pursue a misplaced object in a room, urgently, narrowly, over and over, scanning the same surfaces and wondering why you can't see it. What if the scanning is the problem, not the lack of the thing? There's a reason this teaching has been kept close, passed in fragments, embedded in doctrine and myth, rather than spoken plainly. It asks something disorienting of the listener. It asks you to consider that the very mechanism you've been using to move toward what you want, the striving, the effort, the leaning, might be the thing standing precisely between you and it. Not because effort is wrong in all domains, but because certain doors, the ones that matter most, the ones that lead into states of being rather than positions of having, those doors have a backward hinge. You cannot force your way into peace. You cannot strain your way into ease. You cannot perform your way into authenticity. Every attempt to do so contains within it the proof of the absence it's trying to overcome. And here is where it gets delicate. Here is where this teaching asks the most of you. Because the answer isn't to stop caring. It isn't to manufacture indifference or to perform non-attachment as if it were a new strategy. That's just the same door with a different disguise. Trying to seem like you're not trying is still trying. The mind is not fooled by its own theater. What's being pointed at is something far more interior than behavior. It's a shift at the level of what you actually feel about the thing you want, not what you perform feeling, what you feel. The sleeper who's been awake for 3 hours doesn't need to pretend they don't want sleep. They need something else. Something that happens beneath the level of wanting, in the place where the body's own intelligence lives, the place that knows how to breathe without being told, that knows how to heal a cut without your instruction. That intelligence doesn't strain, it functions. And when you release the override, when the effortful conscious mind steps back, it resumes its natural work. There's a very specific thing that happens in the body and mind of a person who has genuinely released their grip on a desired state. You might have felt it once, briefly, in some moment you didn't plan. A moment where you stopped trying, not from defeat, but from a kind of full, quiet acceptance. And in that moment, without explanation, something shifted. What if that moment wasn't an accident? What if it was a glimpse of the mechanism? And what if the question worth carrying into your night, into the quiet space after these words fade, is simply this? What are you still gripping so tightly that your grip has become the only reason it hasn't arrived? Chapter 2. The Testimony of the Sleepless. There is an answer to that question, and you already know it. You've always known it. The grip itself, the white-knuckled insistence that a thing must arrive, is the precise force that holds it at a distance. It isn't poetic. It isn't a consolation offered to the frustrated. It's a law, as indifferent and as certain as gravity. And the most honest place to witness it operating is in a room at 3 in the morning, where you're lying very still, trying not to try. You know this room. Maybe you've lived inside it for years. The ceiling is the same ceiling it always is. The sounds of the house settle into themselves. Your body is horizontal, which is the correct position. The conditions are, by every measure, favorable. And yet, you're awake. Not restless in any interesting way, not visited by inspiration or grief, but awake in the most humiliating sense, awake while wanting desperately not to be, awake while watching yourself be awake, which is its own particular torment. This is where the backwards law begins its teaching. Notice what you're doing in that room. You're not merely failing to sleep. You're doing something active, something strenuous. You're monitoring. There's a part of you scanning the interior landscape every few moments, checking the readings, asking, is it happening yet? Am I closer? The question itself is a form of alertness. The checking itself is wakefulness. And so the more sincerely you pursue sleep, the more precisely you replicate the conditions that prevent it. Sleep, understood clearly, is not a thing you can do. It's a threshold you can only cross by accident. By a surrendering of the witnessing self so complete that the witness can no longer report on whether it's happened. The moment you're aware that you're falling asleep, you've already arrested the fall. The very act of watching for sleep is the act of remaining awake. You cannot observe your way into unconsciousness, and so the sleepless lie there, applying effort to effortlessness. They try to relax. They instruct their bodies to let go. They breathe in the way they've been told is calming, counting, pacing, controlling, which is to say, they do everything except the one thing that would work. Stop trying to make it happen. Now, here is where the testimony becomes clinical. Here is where the pattern crosses from philosophy into proof. In the middle of the 20th century, a physician and psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl, working out of Vienna, was treating patients whose suffering had become self-reinforcing. He noticed something that others had named but not yet weaponized: the fear of a symptom. The desperate attempt to prevent it was itself producing the symptom with remarkable reliability. The person terrified of blushing would blush. The person who couldn't sleep because they feared not sleeping would lie awake, confirmed in their fear, accumulating evidence for the next night's terror. Frankl understood that you couldn't argue someone out of this loop. Logic made no difference because the loop wasn't logical, it was mechanical. So he did something that sounds at first hearing like cruelty. He told his insomniac patients to try to stay awake. Not as a trick, not with a wink that said, do the opposite of what I say. He meant it as a sincere instruction: stay awake as long as you can. Make it your project for the night. Keep watch, don't sleep. They fell asleep within minutes. Let that land. These were people who had sometimes spent years failing to sleep, who had arranged their entire lives around the accommodation of their inability to sleep, who had tried every remedy and found that trying made it worse. And they fell asleep within minutes of being told that sleep was no longer the goal. Because the goal had changed, the effort had changed, and because the effort had changed, the interference had dissolved. There was nothing left to pursue, and so nothing left to flee from. The monitoring process, the internal warden that had been awake all night checking for sleep, had been given a new assignment: stay awake. And the body, unburdened of the striving, simply did what it had always been capable of doing. It let go. Frankl called his technique paradoxical intention. The doctrine in this text calls it something older: the application of the backwards door. You stop walking toward the threshold directly, you turn your back, and the door, which had been sealed against all your pushing, swings open behind you. Now feel the weight of what this means beyond the bedroom. Insomnia is the purest laboratory, because the mechanism is so swift, so visible, so undeniable in the moment of its operation. You can feel the pursuit producing the opposite in real time. But the mechanism doesn't discriminate. It doesn't reserve itself for sleep alone and permit direct effort to work everywhere else. It's a feature of how desire and consciousness interact at a fundamental level. When you lie awake wanting sleep, you are not simply tired. You are a person whose attention has collapsed around a single point, constricting around it the way a fist constricts around something it fears losing. That constriction is real. It has a texture, a temperature. It lives in the chest, the jaw, the space behind the eyes. And it is the constriction, not the absence of sleep, that keeps you from the threshold. This is the testimony of the sleepless, that wanting too much in exactly the wrong direction with the full force of the conscious will is sometimes the most efficient way to ensure the thing never comes. You felt this, not just in beds and dark rooms. You felt the version of this that lives inside conversations where you were trying too hard to be liked. The version that lives inside performances where you were too aware of yourself performing. The version that lives inside silences where the right words refused to come because you were straining after them. In every one of those moments, you were the insomniac. You were lying there very still, trying not to try, and the trying was the problem. The ancient teachers understood this, though they arrived at it from the inside rather than from the laboratory. They described a quality of action, or perhaps non-action, that achieves without striving, that flows without force. Not passivity, not resignation, but something altogether more precise. The alignment of intention with release, so that the two become the same gesture. An arrow loosed from a bow that's no longer trembling. What Frankl confirmed in the clinic was the same teaching in different clothing. Release is not the absence of desire, it's the maturation of it. It's desire that's learned to stop clutching, to stop monitoring, to stop checking the ceiling every few seconds for signs that it's working. It's the turning of the back, and sleep, when it comes that way, arrives without announcement. That's the other thing the sleepless discover. When they finally stop fighting, they never feel themselves cross the threshold. One moment the room is there, then there's morning. So now, the question that carries you forward, if the effort to sleep is what kept you awake, and if the release of that effort is what finally let you cross the threshold, then sit very quietly with this. What else have you been lying awake inside of? What other rooms have you been monitoring all night, checking the ceiling, convinced that the state you want is just barely out of reach, not knowing that the reaching is the only wall. Chapter 3. The Ironic Mind and its White Bear. Here is what you need to understand before anything else. The pattern you glimpsed in the sleepless room, that strange inversion where effort produces its opposite, isn't a quirk of exhaustion. It isn't a feature of tired minds operating past their limit. It's a feature of mind itself, of your mind, of the very instrument you've been using faithfully and with great sincerity to pursue every state you've ever wanted and failed to enter. There's a name for the mechanism, not a metaphor yet, an actual name, a clinical description of something researchers found by watching what happens inside thought when you tell it what not to do. Don't think of a white bear. You just did. You couldn't help it. And if you're listening carefully right now, some part of you is still watching for it, still glancing toward that interior space where the white bear lives, making sure it hasn't reappeared, which means it's there, which means the instruction to suppress it has done the precise opposite of what it intended. This is the ironic process, and it is the architecture behind everything this doctrine asks you to understand. When the mind is given an instruction to suppress something, to not think a thought, to not feel a feeling, to not want a thing too obviously, it splits. One part of you executes the suppression, reaches toward other thoughts, steers attention away, cooperates sincerely. But another part, the part that makes the suppression possible at all, must monitor for the unwanted thing constantly. It has to know what it's avoiding. It has to hold the forbidden image or feeling or state in a kind of interior viewing room, checking it, confirming it's still absent, confirming the suppression is still working, and in the act of checking it summons, every single time. The warden can't sleep. That's the truth no one tells you. The part of your mind assigned to keep something away is the most vigilant presence you carry. It never takes its eyes off the thing it's guarding against. And so the thing it's guarding against never truly leaves. It lives in the monitoring. It breathes inside the checking. The suppression is its life support. Think about what this means for the things you've been pushing away from yourself, the thought you've decided you mustn't have, the fear you've been determined not to show, the longing you've been trying to keep at a dignified distance, telling yourself you don't need it that badly, that you're fine, that you've released it. Every time you check whether you've released it, you're in the viewing room. Every time you feel relief that it didn't surface, that relief is itself the proof that the warden just confirmed its presence and decided it was still contained. You haven't released the thing. You've hired a full-time guard for it and called that release. Now turn it in the other direction, because this is where the doctrine opens fully. Think about what you've been reaching toward rather than away from, a state of confidence, a sense of belonging. The feeling of being someone whose life has weight, whose presence has gravity. Or something quieter than that, something more personal, the thing you've wanted so long you've stopped saying its name out loud. When you reach for it, when you monitor for its arrival, when you check daily whether it's appeared yet, the ironic process does the same thing in reverse. The monitoring mind must keep alive a clear picture of the state's absence in order to measure whether it's arrived. So absence is what gets reinforced. Absence is what gets vivid. The warden, assigned to watch for your desire's fulfillment, is standing in a room where the desire is perpetually unfulfilled, using that unfulfillment as its measuring stick, and reporting back to you constantly. Not yet. Still not yet. The grasping is the mechanism of the distance, not a metaphor, a mechanism. There was a researcher, Daniel Wegner, who ran the white bear experiment in many forms, who mapped this process with careful attention. What he found, stated plainly, is that suppression rebounds. That the harder you push a thought down, the more forcefully it returns the moment your attention relaxes. The effort itself charges the thought. Every act of resistance is a deposit into the very thing you're trying to empty. And the monitoring process, the internal warden, is always there, even when you're not aware of it, especially when you're not aware of it, tirelessly maintaining the thought it was built to erase. You felt this, you know the texture of it, the word you can't remember that becomes more absent the harder you reach for it. Then arrives the moment you've walked away to make tea. The name on the tip of your tongue that the tongue can't release until the tongue stops trying. The insight that wouldn't come while you sat at the desk, willing it to appear, and arrived instead in the shower, in the half-sleep, in the moment your grip on the problem finally loosened enough for the solution to move. Your mind has always known the backwards way. It's found it in small things, in words and names and sudden recognitions, but somehow with the things that matter most, you've decided those rules don't apply. With those you've tried harder, with those you've monitored more carefully, with those you've kept the warden awake longest and fed it most faithfully. Here is what this doctrine asks you to sit with now. Not as an instruction, not yet, just as a recognition. Every state you've been straining toward has a warden. Every desire you've clutched tightly is being monitored from the inside by something that cannot help but keep the absence vivid in order to measure for arrival. The white bear you were told not to think of is still in that viewing room. It's been there every moment you've tried to be rid of it. And there's a different kind of white bear too, one you might not have noticed. Not the thing you've been pushing away, but the state you've been pursuing so earnestly that the pursuit has become your most familiar posture. The version of yourself you've been trying to arrive at. The room you've been trying to enter. The threshold you've been pressing against with both hands. That too has a warden. That too is being held alive in precisely the form of its absence by the part of you assigned to watch for it. The watching is what's in the way, not circumstances, not timing, not the particular shape of your history, the warden. And the next question, the one this doctrine has been walking you toward since the very first moment, isn't how to dismiss the warden, or defeat it, or retrain it through effort. That would be more of the same mechanism, more suppression, another level of ironic rebound. No, the question is older and stranger and quieter than that. What would happen if you simply, without drama, without announcement, without monitoring whether you'd done it correctly, let the warden rest? But before you answer that, there's something else you need to see. Because the white bear lives not only in your thoughts, it lives in your body. It lives in the flush that rises in a room full of people, in the voice that catches at exactly the moment you most need it not to, in the hand that shakes when steadiness is what the moment requires. So sit with this first, your white bear, the one that got louder the longer you fought it, the one you've been feeding with every act of resistance, every careful monitoring, every quiet daily check to see if it's finally gone. How long have you been keeping it alive by fighting it? Chapter 4. The blush, the stammer, the shaking hand. You've been keeping it alive by fighting it, that's the answer. And now you're going to feel that answer not just in the quiet of the mind, but in the surface of the skin. The body knows the backwards law before the intellect does. It's been demonstrating it your entire life, in small humiliations, in moments you still remember with a particular warmth of embarrassment. The mind can almost argue its way around the law. The body cannot. The body is honest in a way the reasoning self rarely permits itself to be, and so we turn to the body now, because the body is where the law becomes undeniable. Think of the blush. There is no experience quite like it in the whole architecture of self-consciousness. You feel it rising before it arrives, a warmth at the base of the throat, a slow tide moving upward, and the moment you feel it begin, you want to stop it. You concentrate on stopping it. You will yourself, with everything you have, not to flush. And what happens is so reliable, so ruthlessly mechanical, that calling it a law feels like an understatement. The blood rushes in. The color deepens. The thing you were trying to prevent becomes the only thing happening in the room. And everyone can see it. Because you made it impossible to miss, not through some failure of will, but through the precise and total application of will. The blush isn't a betrayal. It's an obedient response, perfectly obedient to the command you actually issued, which was, notice this, monitor this, do not let this happen. The mind's monitoring system that warden you met in the previous movement of this doctrine doesn't understand the word don't. It understands what you're pointing at, and you pointed at the blush. So the blush became the entire sky. Now the stammer. Someone who has never stammered can barely imagine what the stammerer experiences in the moment before speech. It isn't simply nervousness, it's something far more precise and terrible. It's the attempt to control what cannot be controlled by controlling it. The stammerer, particularly one who has grown self-conscious about the stammer, enters every sentence already listening for the mistake. They are monitoring the throat, the tongue, the breath, the first syllable of the next word. They're trying to guide their own speech the way you might try to guide a river with your hands. And the speech, like the river, knows nothing of your intentions. It responds to the tension, not the desire. The effort not to stammer is the stammer. This isn't poetic, it's mechanical. The muscular coordination that produces fluent speech requires a kind of unconscious trust, a willingness to let the system run itself without supervision. The moment supervision arrives, the system falters. The watcher makes itself known through the very breakdown it was trying to prevent. And the stammerer watches themselves. Stammer monitors their own monitoring, tightens around the tightening, and the loop closes in on itself like a fist. The shaking hand is the same story, told in the fingers. You've seen this. Perhaps you've lived this. A presentation, a toast, a moment of visibility where steadiness is what the situation seems to demand. And somewhere, in the preparation for that moment, a thought arrives. What if my hand shakes? And from that moment forward, steadiness becomes the quarry. You're hunting it. You're trying to manufacture it, trying to perform it, and the performance itself is the tremor's invitation. The hand knows you're watching. The hand responds to watching the way all self-conscious things respond, by becoming uncertain of itself, by losing the automatic confidence it would have had if you'd simply looked away. There's a physician, working in the first half of the last century, who noticed something extraordinary about his patients suffering these loops. Not the stammer only, but all the varieties of self-defeating self-consciousness. The blusher, the shaker, the one whose mind went blank at the crucial moment. He began doing something that looked, from the outside, almost cruel. He instructed the blusher to blush. He told the stammerer to stammer as hard as they could. He asked the shaker to shake with everything they had. The results were not what common sense would predict. When the blusher tried to blush on purpose, the blush retreated. When the stammerer aimed for the maximum stammer, fluency arrived instead, not perfectly, not without effort, but the loop broke. When the shaker tried to amplify the shake, the hand steadied, because the instruction had changed the relationship between the watcher and the watched. The self-consciousness had been turned inside out. Instead of the symptom being the enemy, it had become the assignment. And you cannot fear what you've been asked to produce. You cannot brace against what you've been invited to welcome. This is the forced symptom technique. It's not a trick. It's an application of the backwards door so direct it becomes almost uncomfortable to acknowledge, because it reveals how much of what you suffer is a product of your own management of the suffering. You can test this in your own life. The next time you feel the flush beginning in a room full of people, instead of willing it to stop, try to make it deeper. Try to bring the color all the way up. Try to be, on purpose, the reddest person in the room. Notice what the body does with that instruction. Notice how the relationship between you and the symptom shifts the moment you're no longer at war with it. You're not eliminating the blush, you're changing sides, and the moment you change sides, the siege lifts. This works. For the same reason, the insomniac falls asleep when told to stay awake. The effort was the obstacle, not the symptom. The effort to prevent the symptom. Remove the effort, and what remains is a body that knows very well how to regulate itself, that has always known that was only disrupted by the supervision you brought to it. But here's what matters beyond the mechanics. Here's what the blush, the stammer, and the shaking hand are actually teaching you about the nature of wanting. Every desire you've been straining toward has this same loop inside it. The self-consciousness that produces the blush is simply the body's version of something the whole self does around every longing it holds too tightly. You want something. You want it with enough urgency that you begin monitoring for it, checking for signs of its approach, watching yourself in the act of wanting it. And that watching, that monitoring, becomes the thing that keeps it just beyond reach. The distance isn't between you and what you want. The distance is between you and the version of yourself who isn't watching. Because that version of you, the one not watching, already knows how to move through the room without flushing. Already knows how to speak without listening to itself speak. Already knows how to hold the glass without asking whether the hand will hold steady. That version of you is right here, available, has always been available, waiting underneath the supervision. And the question that's been circling through all of this, the one that the blush and the stammer keep pointing toward, is this. What would actually happen if you stopped treating your own responses as enemies? Not just the flush of color in a crowded room, not just the caught breath before a sentence, but all of it. Every unwanted response, every reaction you've been managing, every impulse you've been overriding. What's actually underneath the management? And is it as dangerous as the managing has implied? Chapter 5. Wu Wei and the Shape of Water. What's underneath the management is life itself. That's the answer, and it's both simpler and more unsettling than anything the managing mind wants to hear. Underneath, every override, every supervision, every careful redirection of your own natural responses, there's something that was never broken. Something that's been moving all along, quietly, the way a river moves beneath ice. You've been managing it because you were taught that it needed managing, but the doctrine you're walking into now is older than that teaching, far older. It doesn't come from a seminar room or a self-improvement tradition. It comes from a way of seeing that predates the very notion that reality is something to be conquered. The ancient teachers called it Wu Wei. And before you hear that word as something distant, something belonging to a culture or a tradition that isn't yours, let me tell you what it actually is. It isn't passivity. It isn't surrender in the way a defeated person surrenders. It isn't giving up, lying down, dissolving into inaction. Those are the misreadings, the ones that have made this doctrine easy to dismiss. Wu Wei is something far more precise and far more powerful than any of that. Wu Wei is the art of moving with what's already moving. Consider water, not as a symbol, not as a pretty image for a calendar, but as a teacher. Water doesn't fight the rock in its path. It doesn't push, doesn't argue, doesn't strategize. It simply finds the available space, the gap, the seam, the tiny fault in what seemed impenetrable, and it moves through. Given enough time, given only that patient willingness to go where it can go, water reshapes mountains. Canyons hundreds of feet deep, cut not by force but by the quiet persistence of something that never once hardened itself against the stone. The stone, you'll notice, does not win. And yet we've been trained to admire the stone's quality, the hardness, the resistance, the unyielding nature of a thing that holds its shape against all pressure. We've been told that this is strength, that the one who pushes hardest, grips tightest, fights most fiercely, is the one who arrives. And so we've spent our lives being stone, wondering why we're exhausted, wondering why the things we want keep flowing around us rather than into us. Here's what the doctrine says, and what your own experience is about to confirm. Hardness is a strategy for a world that doesn't exist. The world you're actually living in is fluid. It's in motion. Every state you've wanted, every version of yourself you've been reaching toward, every quality you've felt was just barely out of grasp, those things aren't locked behind a door that requires more force. They're currents. And you've been trying to swim upstream toward them while the current was always flowing the other way. The fighter and the one who flows aren't just two personality types, they're two entirely different relationships with reality. The fighter believes the desired state is over there, separate, defended, requiring conquest. The one who flows understands that the desired state is the natural direction of things, and that only resistance has been keeping them from it. These aren't metaphors for how to feel. They're descriptions of two different mechanics. Two different ways the same universe responds. You've met people who seem to move through life as if it accommodates them, not because they're lucky, not because the world has given them an easier road, but because they've stopped bracing against it. There's a quality to how they enter a room, how they hold a conversation, how they respond when something shifts unexpectedly. It's not confidence in the way we usually mean confidence, as a performance, a posture, a thing to project. It's something quieter than that. It's the quality of a person who isn't fighting what's happening. That quality has a name. It's the same quality water has. The ancient teachers called it Te, the virtue or power that flows from alignment with the natural course of things. Not power over, but power through. The power of the thing that isn't bracing, isn't resisting, isn't spending half its energy maintaining its own hardness. Now take that understanding and lay it over everything you've been learning in these pages. The insomniac who tries harder to sleep and finds sleep retreating, the voice that trembles because it's being watched by its own surveillance. The blush that arrives precisely because its arrival was feared. In every one of those cases, what's happening is the story of the fighter. The mind deciding that what's natural must be controlled, and in controlling it, making it wild. In managing it, making it unmanageable. Wu Wei doesn't ask you to stop wanting. It doesn't tell you that desire is the problem or that wanting things is a spiritual error. That's a different doctrine, and not this one. What Wu Wei asks, what it's always been asking, is whether the wanting can be clean, whether you can hold a desire without hardening around it, whether you can be oriented toward something without treating its absence as an emergency requiring force. The shape of water teaches this in a way that bypasses argument. Water is absolutely oriented. It's always going somewhere, always following its own nature, always moving toward lower ground. Its direction is completely clear, but it doesn't strain. It doesn't panic when it encounters the rock. It doesn't conclude that the rock's existence means water has failed. It simply moves as it moves, and the rock, over time, yields. This is what release actually looks like when you stop confusing it with giving up. Release isn't the abandonment of desire. It's the removal of the white-knuckled grip around desire. The grip that says, if I stop forcing this, it won't happen. The grip that's been burning your energy for years in some cases, maintaining a pressure that was never going to open the door. The backwards door doesn't yield to force because force is itself the announcement of absence. Every time you push, you're broadcasting a signal that says the thing isn't here yet, and the universe, if we can call it that, the deep structure of your own inner life and how it relates to outer circumstance, responds to that signal. It confirms the absence you've announced. Not as punishment, not as indifference, but as a simple echo of what you've been insisting is true. Water never insists. Water simply moves in the direction that's available. And what's available, what's always been available, is the natural channel that forms when you stop trying to carve it by force. There's a moment in the practice of this, and you'll find it when the ideas in this text stop being concepts and start being lived, where the hardness begins to go. Not all at once. Not in a flash of revelation, though for some the shift does arrive suddenly. But in that moment, there's a recognition of something that was always underneath the grip. Some original ease. Some quality of movement that never actually disappeared, that was only waiting under all the management, all the effort, all the strategic pursuit of states that keep moving away. It's the recognition water has, if water could know itself, that it was never the problem, that the canyon was always going to form, that the only question was how long the stone would pretend to be permanent. And so, the question that rises now naturally without pressure is this: if the softest thing overcomes the hardest, what have you been hardening yourself against? And, more quietly beneath that, what would begin to move the moment you stopped? Chapter 6. Wanting proves the lack. Something begins to move the moment you stop. Not because stopping is a trick, not because release is a technique you've deployed cleverly, but because the movement was always there underneath the hardening, waiting for the stone to remember it was never permanent. You felt this. You felt the strange relief of giving up on something, that moment when exhaustion finally wins and you put the wanting down, and then almost insultingly quickly the thing appears, or something better appears, or the path to it simply becomes visible where before there was only wall. You've called that coincidence. You've called it luck or timing, or the universe being cruel in its humor. But it wasn't any of those things. It was mechanics. It was the backwards door swinging open the moment your hands left it. Now we arrive at the deepest layer of the doctrine. Wanting, in its raw, unexamined form, is a broadcast. It's a continuous signal sent from the center of your self-concept outward into the architecture of your experience. And what it says, what it cannot help saying is, this is not here. Every time the want rises, and you feel it as a want, as that particular ache of reaching toward something absent, the signal goes out again. Not here, still not here. The absence is noted, confirmed, and the self-concept, which is nothing more than your deepest settled belief about the shape of your life, receives the message and builds accordingly. This isn't mysticism. This is how a mind works. The self-concept doesn't respond to what you wish were true. It responds to what you feel is true. And the feeling of wanting something, the feeling of needing it, of its absence being a kind of wound you're walking around with, that feeling is the most honest report the self-concept ever receives. It believes it. It acts on it. It organizes your perception, your attention, your behavior, all of it, around the confirmed reality of the absence. The wanting proves the lack. Every reaching redraws the gap. You need to understand what this means, and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean desire itself is the enemy. Desire is one of the most alive forces in a human life. It's the current that moves through everything worth having, everything worth becoming. The doctrine doesn't ask you to become hollow, to scrub yourself clean of wanting, and walk through life as an indifferent observer. That's not release. That's another form of suppression, and you've already learned what suppression produces. What the doctrine asks you to see is the difference between having a desire and gripping a desire. Gripping is what happens when the wanting becomes fused with the awareness of absence, when the desire carries, inside it, a contraction, a tightening, a monitoring, when part of you is always checking, always measuring the distance between where you are and where the desire lives. And that measurement, that constant anxious arithmetic, is the grip. The grip is where the repulsion lives. Because the grip is continuous, proof delivered from the deepest part of you to the deepest part of you, that the thing is not here, has not come, may never come, and your watch must continue. You've felt the grip. It's different from ordinary wanting the way a clenched fist is different from an open hand. Both are hands, but only one of them can receive anything. So, the question the doctrine raises isn't whether you want, it's how you carry the wanting. It's whether the wanting is a wound you keep pressing on, or whether it's something you can set down. This is what's being called the released desire. The released desire isn't the extinguished desire. It isn't the desire you've talked yourself out of, or the desire you've decided is too dangerous to hold because wanting it has hurt you before. That isn't release. That's grief wearing the mask of wisdom. The released desire is still fully itself. It hasn't been diminished or intellectualized away or replaced with something more acceptable. It's still there, still real, still yours, but it's been set down. Setting a desire down means no longer using it as evidence of your current state. It means holding the preference without holding the proof of its absence. It means the wanting exists in you, the way a direction exists on a compass, as orientation, as pointing, without the desperate insistence that you are not yet there, that arrival is perpetually withheld, that the gap between you and it is the most real thing in the room. Think of someone you know who seems to effortlessly attract the very things other people strain toward. You've noticed this. There's a quality in them that's hard to name, something between ease and confidence, but not quite either. What you're sensing is the absence of the grip. They want things sometimes deeply, but the wanting doesn't hollow them out. They don't carry the wound of the absence. The desire lives in them, without the contraction, without the monitoring, without the continuous broadcast of not yet. And so the self-concept they're broadcasting is one of wholeness, not lack. The signal they're sending isn't a report of a gap. It's something closer to an open hand. The mechanics, at this level, become very still. When you set the desire down, you remove the signal. You stop sending the confirmation of absence. The self-concept, which is nothing more than a very loyal mirror, stops organizing your reality around a lack that was never carved into anything permanent. And what was always possible, what was never truly blocked by anything except the grip itself, begins to find its way toward the open hand. This isn't passive. It's the most active thing you'll ever do, because it requires you to stop doing the thing that feels like action, but is actually the exact shape of the obstruction. It requires you to recognize that the effort you've been calling pursuit has been functioning as a wall, that the intensity of your wanting, expressed as need, as longing, as the daily confirmation of what isn't here yet, has been the most faithful servant of the very absence it was trying to end. The water doesn't try to fill the canyon. It simply moves, and the canyon forms. You don't have to perform indifference. You don't have to pretend the desire isn't there. Both of those are the white bear strategy, and you know where that leads. You simply practice setting the desire down without putting it away, holding the direction without holding the wound, knowing what you want, without that knowing being a daily accounting of what you don't yet have. There's a subtlety here that takes time to feel, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Because here's what the doctrine is pointing toward, quietly, from underneath everything it's said so far. The grip, the wound, the contraction around the wanting isn't really about the thing you want. It's about what you believe, the absence of that thing says about you. It's about the self-concept at the center of the whole architecture. The lack was never out there. It was always in here, in what you've settled into believing about the shape of your life, the shape of what's available to you, the shape of what you are. And so the released desire isn't really a technique for getting what you want. It's the beginning of a much quieter and more permanent question. Not, what do I want, and how do I remove the grip from it? But what do I actually believe I am? What would remain of this wanting, and how would it feel in the body if the absence were no longer the truest thing I knew? Can you want something without that wanting being a wound? And beneath that, even more quietly, what would you discover about the wanting itself if the wound were finally allowed to close? Chapter 7. The Architecture of Assumption. The wound, as it turns out, isn't in the wanting. It never was. The wound is in the architecture, the invisible structure you've built around yourself and called a self. And that structure, that inner scaffolding of assumption and belief, is doing something right now that you haven't been told clearly enough. It's deciding what enters your life and what doesn't. Not by wishing, not by effort, not by the elaborate strategies of pursuit, but by the simple, ancient, completely unsentimental fact of what it believes itself to already be. This is the doctrine this text has been circling toward from its first breath. Everything that came before was clearing ground. The backwards door, the sleepless nights, the white bear, the burning blush, the released desire. All of it was excavation. You are being shown what doesn't work, and more crucially, why it doesn't work, so that when this moment arrived, you'd be ready to actually hear it. Here it is. The self isn't a seeker, it's a mirror. And what a mirror does, its only function, its entire nature, is to reflect outward what's held inward. Not what's hoped for, not what's prayed toward. What's assumed. Assumption is an old word, and it carries the weight it deserves. When something is assumed, it isn't reached for. It isn't proved, it simply is. You assume the floor will hold your weight when you step out of bed. You don't press your foot down tentatively and hope. You don't visualize the floor being solid. You simply step. That ease, that complete absence of monitoring, that's not confidence built through repetition, though repetition may have helped. That's assumption. It's the state, past belief, past hope, past affirmation. It's the state in which the question has already been settled. Now feel the contrast. Think of something you want, something you've wanted long enough that the wanting has a particular texture, a certain ache. Notice what happens in the body. There's a reaching in it, isn't there? A leaning. The very shape of the wanting is a shape that points toward absence, toward something not yet here, toward a distance that must be crossed. And that leaning, that forward tilt of the inner self, is broadcasting a signal into the structure of your experience. And the signal it's broadcasting is this: not yet, not mine, not here. The monitoring warden, the one you met in earlier pages, recognizes this signal immediately. It's exactly the kind of tension the warden was built to track. Straining toward something keeps the thing at arm's length. The same mechanism, the same law, applied now not to sleep or to the blush, but to the whole shape of a life. So the question becomes, what would it feel like to assume it, not to affirm it, not to repeat it, not to visualize it with effort, and hope to assume it, to inhabit the state of one who already knows? There's a specific quality to that knowing. It's quiet, it's undefended. It doesn't need to argue with the present circumstances, because it isn't looking at the present circumstances as evidence of anything. It's resting in a different layer of the self entirely, a layer beneath the reactive mind, beneath the monitoring warden, beneath the hoping and the proving. Call this layer the assumed self, not the desired self, not the future self, not the ideal self, projected outward onto a distant timeline. The assumed self is the version of you that already exists on the inside of the door you've been circling. It doesn't reach, it doesn't strive, it simply knows. And from that knowing, it moves. Here's where the mechanics become undeniable. The assumed self doesn't activate the warden. This is the key that unlocks the entire architecture. When you strain toward a state, you create the very tension that the monitoring process feeds on. When you assume a state, there's nothing to monitor, nothing to suppress, nothing to keep at bay. The warden has no assignment. It stands down. And in that standing down, in that quiet absence of opposition, the thing assumed begins, without effort, without drama, without even necessarily being noticed at first, to arrange itself as experience. This isn't magic. It's the same principle you've already seen operating in every domain this text has visited. The student who stops trying to seem intelligent and simply acts from a place of assumed competence draws attention and recognition without ever performing for it. The conversation that flows without self-consciousness. Because the speaker has momentarily forgotten to monitor the speaker, carries a warmth and ease that no amount of practiced charm could manufacture. The door opens, because the back has been turned on the door. Because the one who walks through has already, in some interior country, arrived. This interior country is everything. It's the actual site of transformation, not the outer circumstances, not the conditions that are being waited on, not the evidence the world is being asked to provide. The self-concept, the deep, settled assumption of what you are and what is already true of you, is the medium through which all experience is rendered. Shift the assumption, and the rendering changes not because you've changed the world, because you've changed the mirror. And the shift can't be forced. That's the final exquisite irony the backwards law delivers here, its last lesson in this particular key. You can't force yourself into assumption. You can't strain your way into the settled knowing, because the straining is itself evidence that the knowing hasn't arrived. What you can do, what the work of these pages has been preparing you to do, is release the grip of the contrary assumption, the one that says not yet and not mine, and I'm still waiting. You can notice it, as you would notice a white bear, and choose not to fight it. Let it exhaust itself. Let it dissolve, the way all tension dissolves when it's no longer being fed by resistance. What remains beneath the grip, beneath the straining, is already closer to assumption than you think, because the wanting itself, as you saw in the last movement of this doctrine, isn't a wound by nature. Strip away the urgency, strip away the evidence of absence, and what's left is something quieter, a kind of recognition. The sense that the thing wanted isn't foreign, isn't out there, isn't other. It's a state that has a home in you already, a room in the house that's simply been kept locked. Assumption is the act of walking into that room and sitting down, not claiming it, not announcing it, not working to believe you deserve it, simply sitting down the way you'd sit in any room you knew was yours, without consulting the floor. The self that does this isn't special, it isn't more evolved, or more spiritually advanced, or more deserving. It's just done arguing with itself. It's let the case close. It's stepped out of the courtroom of proof and evidence and into the ordinary, unremarkable life of someone who knows. And here's what's worth carrying into the silence after this. People who've crossed through the backwards door don't tend to describe a dramatic moment of arrival. They describe instead looking up one day and realizing that something has shifted, that they'd been moving differently, thinking from a different place, holding themselves in a way they couldn't quite trace back to a decision, as though the change had been happening beneath the level of watching, as though the door had opened quietly in the dark while they were looking elsewhere. Which leaves only one question to sit with now, the one this entire architecture has been built to ask. What would you already be doing? How would you already be moving through your hours? What would you already assume about the room you wake up in each morning, if somewhere inside you, below the hoping and the waiting, you knew the door had already opened? Chapter 8. Walking backwards through the door. You already know the answer. Not the answer your thinking mind would compose if you gave it time to work, but the answer that's been sitting quietly beneath all the searching, all the careful positioning, all the rehearsed ways you've arranged yourself in the hours before sleep. You already know what it would feel like to move through your days as someone who isn't waiting, someone who isn't monitoring the horizon for a signal, someone whose hands are open not because they've given up, but because they're not holding anything closed. That's the distinction this whole architecture has been moving toward, and it's a narrow one. The difference between release and resignation sits in a single quality of inner posture, and if you rush past it, if you flatten the two into the same thing, you'll miss the only door there is. Resignation is a kind of cold hunger. It wears the face of not caring, but it's still listening. It still turns slightly toward the thing it claims to have released. You felt it before. The studied nonchalance, the deliberate performance of not wanting the way you'd rehearse indifference as a strategy, hoping the universe might be fooled. That's not walking backwards. That's still facing the door, just with your arms crossed. The monitoring process we named in the earlier hours of this teaching knows the difference. The warden doesn't sleep. It hears what you're pretending and keeps perfect count. Release is something else entirely. It has warmth in it. It has the quality of a hand that's been holding something very tightly, not because it wanted to squeeze, but because it was afraid, and then, slowly, remembers that it's safe to open. There's no performance in it. There's no audience. Release is what happens when you stop needing the outcome to confirm that you are all right. That's where the practice lives, not in technique, not in ritual, but in that specific moment of remembering that you were all right before the wanting began. Now here's what it means to walk backwards through the door. It means you turn your full living attention toward the interior state, the felt sense of what it's like to be the person for whom the thing has already arrived. And you rest there, not as a strategy, not because you've been told this is how you attract things, but because it's true. Because the state of having and the state of being are not separated by time. They're separated only by the grip. The wanting is the distance, the release collapses it. This is what the ancient teachers were pointing at from every direction, in every language, through every parable about streams and emptiness and water finding its own level. Not that you should want less, but that you should know more deeply. That knowing, the kind that settles into the bones rather than flashing through the mind, doesn't produce urgency. It produces something that looks, from the outside, almost like ease. When you watch someone who truly does not need the approval of a room, you're not watching someone who's suppressed their desire to connect. You're watching someone whose sense of themselves does not depend on the room's verdict. The room responds to that. It always does. Not because of a law of attraction operating like some mechanical postal system, but because the frequency of self-possession carries a different shape in space than the frequency of appeal. People read it. Situations arrange themselves around it. The door opens before they've reached it. And you can practice this, not by pretending, by remembering. There's a moment available to you, it might take only a breath to find it, where you can step inside the state of already, not the fantasy of already. Not the visualization exercise where you picture yourself holding the object of your desire, but the actual felt sense of someone who's been released from the grip of needing it. Someone who woke up this morning without that particular weight. You know what it feels like to move without a weight you've been carrying, because there have been mornings, maybe few, maybe far apart, when something shifted before you were fully conscious, and you went through a whole hour before you remembered what you were supposed to be anxious about. In that hour, you were free. That hour is available to you as a location. You can stand in it deliberately. Walking backwards through the door is the practice of inhabiting that location, not as an escape from your desire, but as the fulfillment of it. You're not leaving the wanting behind. You're moving to the side of it that's already arrived. You're taking your stand in the having, in the knowing, in the quiet, unperformative assurance that what belongs to you, and that your reaching was never what was going to bring it. The backwards turn is not a loss. Nothing is being surrendered here that was ever truly yours to hold. What you're releasing is the grasping, the vigilance, the low-grade exhaustion of the monitoring process running constantly in the background, checking, rechecking, measuring the distance. When that process quiets, not because it's been forced quiet, but because there's nothing left for it to guard against. Something in the space around you shifts, not metaphorically, in the actual texture of how things go. People describe this moment differently. Some say the world began meeting them rather than resisting them. Some say they stopped having to push. Some say they simply noticed one day that the thing they'd wanted had come without ceremony, without the dramatic arrival they'd imagined, just quietly present in the way that anything familiar eventually feels, as though it had always been there. That's how the door opens, not with a declaration, not with a reward delivered in acknowledgement of your effort. It opens the way all thresholds open when approached correctly, which is to say, it opens as though it was never closed. You've been walking toward it for a long time. Every teaching in these hours has been repositioning your feet, not pointing you somewhere new, but turning you back around towards something you already know, something you knew before the wanting complicated it. The shape of that knowing is not ambition, it's not hope, it's not even faith in the conventional sense. It's the quiet certainty of someone who stopped waiting for proof, because something underneath the proof-seeking already understands. That something is where you live when you're not performing. It's where you were when you were most fully yourself, most at ease, most unguarded. It's the room inside the room. And it's been waiting for you to return to it with less noise. So, you practice the backwards walk not once, not in a single session of deliberate release, but as a recurring return. Every time you feel the grip tighten, every time the monitoring process wakes up and starts measuring the distance between where you are and where you want to be, you notice and you turn, not away from the desire, toward the knowing, toward the part of you that's already standing on the other side of the door. And here's where something subtle becomes important, something that will carry you into the last of what this teaching holds. The person who doesn't want the thing and the person who knows they already have it, they look alike from the outside. Both are still, both carry a certain lightness, both seem unburdened by urgency. But they're standing in entirely different places, and the world treats them entirely differently. What's the difference between them? What is the actual interior distinction, the thing you'd feel if you could stand inside each of them for a moment, that makes one a closed door and the other one open? Chapter 9. The universe behind your back. Here is the difference. The person who doesn't want the thing is empty where the wanting used to be. There's a hollow there, a kind of cleared ground where desire once burned. The person who knows they already have it, they're full, not full of striving, not full of reaching. Full the way. A vessel is full when something has been poured into it and the pouring is complete. One of them lost the fire, the other let it become warmth. That's the whole distance between them, and it's a distance measured not in miles but in a single interior shift that this teaching has been circling towards since its first word. You've been that circling all along. Everything that came before this moment, every chapter of your own life spent pressing forward into what you wanted, every plan made with tight hands and a tighter jaw, every visualization held so firmly it became a kind of clenching, every prayer that was really just a sophisticated form of demand, all of it was you standing at a door and pushing. You didn't know, nobody told you the door opened the other way. Or perhaps something told you, something quiet beneath all that effort, and you couldn't hear it over the sound of your own pushing. That quiet thing. Let's speak about it now. There is a self beneath the self you've been managing, beneath the one who sets intentions and monitors results and checks in anxiously to see whether reality has complied yet, beneath the version of you that wakes in the night and rehearses what hasn't happened, beneath even the version that found this teaching and hoped it might be the final key. There is something older than all of those, something that never needed a technique, something that has simply been present the way bedrock is present beneath a city's noise, unmoved, unasking, already complete in whatever it is. That part of you has known this law your entire life. It knew it when you were young enough that wanting something meant simply being delighted by it, not gripping toward it. It knew it in those rare adult hours when something wonderful arrived, not because you'd worked for it, but because you'd briefly forgotten to prevent it. The unexpected conversation that opened something in you. The moment of creative work that came alive the instant you stopped trying to make it alive. The feeling in a room that shifted the instant you stopped monitoring whether it would shift. You've lived inside this law many times. You've walked through this door before. You just didn't know it was a door. And you couldn't find it again because you looked for it forward. It's always been behind you. This is the teaching at its most distilled, its most stripped. The universe isn't in front of you. It doesn't live in the direction of your effort. It lives in the direction of your release. When you turn away from the door, not in defeat, not in despair, but in the specific and sovereign act of trusting that what you are is already enough for what you want. The door moves not toward you, it moves around you. The hinges are on your side. The opening happens in the space you have just vacated by turning. You can't watch this happen. That's the final tenderness of the law. The moment you turn to check, you've turned back to face it, and it stills again. The mechanism requires your back. It requires your willingness to walk away from the very evidence you want. And this is why so few people ever experience it fully. Not because they lack discipline or desire or faith, but because they can't tolerate the not watching. They turn around too soon. They hear something move behind them and they spin to catch it. Stay turned. This is what every contemplative tradition eventually arrives at, dressed in different robes but saying the same structural thing. The water doesn't flow because you pull it. The fruit doesn't fall because you demand it. The thing you need has its own arrival, and your grip on the need is the only thing interrupting the schedule. To release the grip is not to abandon the wanting, it's to complete it. It's to take the desire from your fist and place it back into your nature, where it already lives as a frequency, as a quality of being, as something the world around you can respond to rather than recoil from. You've been carrying this for a long time, the weight of it, the vigilance of someone who believes the wanted thing will only arrive if they maintain constant pressure toward it. You've been the guard at the gate of your own becoming, and you've been so faithful to that post that you never noticed the gate was open the whole time, on the other side, in the direction you had your back to. Now, right now, not as a practice, not as a technique to deploy and then monitor for results, but as a simple recognition, the way you'd recognize your own name, spoken in a crowded room. Whatever you've been gripping toward, you can feel it. That particular tension you've been holding so long, it no longer registers as tension. It registers as normal. That's the handle. That's the door you've been pushing. You don't need to let go with force. Forcing the letting go is just another push. You only need to notice, to become aware of the hand on the handle, to feel the specific texture of the grip, and to let the awareness itself do what awareness does when it's honest, which is to dissolve the thing it looks at clearly enough. The doctrine this text has carried from its first breath is not a secret about effort. It's a secret about direction. Everything the effortful self does is turned the wrong way. Not wrong in value, not wrong in sincerity, only wrong the way you'd be wrong to push a pull door with everything you had. The door isn't punishing you. It's just built differently than you assumed. And now you know how it's built. The soul beneath your will has always known. It's been patient with the effortful self the way depth is patient with the surface. It hasn't been waiting for you to succeed at the work. It's been waiting for you to finish being exhausted by it. It's been waiting for this, the moment when the hands come off the handle, when the body stops bracing, when the long-held breath finally fully goes. There is a door behind you right now. You can't see it. That's precisely the condition. It doesn't open into view. It opens into the life that's been assembling itself in the space behind your reaching, in the territory you left unguarded while you were busy pressing forward. It's been building there in the dark, patient and unhurried, the way all real things build. Not because you made it happen, because you are what you are, and what you are calls things toward it, the way a quiet flame calls the dark. The hands are off the handle now. Something is moving. Don't turn around.